Goedemiddag iedereen. Dank voor het kijken. Ik ben Ghana Luden, directeur van CIDI. En ik heet u allen welkom. In particularly, welcome to Michal Cotler-Wunsh from Israel, who is agreed to talk to us about a few things. I will introduce Michal very shortly, and then I'll give her the floor for a while, after which we will start a conversation. And of course, all those watching are more than welcome to add their comments and questions using the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Michal is a member of the Blue and White Party, and she's a Knesset member of the current Knesset, although she is not returning to the Knesset. She's not candidated herself again. She maybe will talk more about it now, or maybe we'll keep it for the questions. I leave the choice to you, Michal, and I give you the floor. Thanks for coming, and please.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you for everybody who's here. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you on not only an important day in terms of Israel's democracy, of course, another election, a fourth in under 2 years, but also as we head into and usher in Passover and sort of begin reflecting, and gives us great perspective on, the thousands of years of history and the journey towards freedom, the journey that we sometimes forget and take for granted in a state of Israel that is only nearly 73 years old, still really the nascent state, and the return of an indigenous people to an ancestral homeland, but in this version, the modern state of Israel, a work in progress. So with regards to today's election, that is very much the way that I look at it, in a very, very hopeful manner. And that doesn't mean that today's results as they come in, and it will take a while because of the COVID-19 reality, it'll take longer than usual to have final results. And I'll say the following: I also think it demands a great deal of humility, not only because of the COVID-19 limitations in this election, but in general, because of what I described a little bit before, a fourth election in 2 years. You are right, indeed. I am currently a member of the Knesset, the 23rd Knesset. I am not a candidate in this current election. I actually excused myself from running in this current election in many, many ways because of the dysfunction that I identified that would not enable me to serve the issues and the voices that I'm committed to serving, advancing, and sounding. At the moment, from Knesset, I am completely committed to identify the ways in which to continue advancing those from platforms outside of the Knesset with a complete and utter sense of responsibility to return to Knesset, because at the end of the day, that is where policy is made, where changes that need to be made can be made in terms of what I referred to before, a almost 73-year-old country that is a work in progress. Just a little bit about myself. I actually grew up in Montreal, Canada. So perhaps that actually lends itself, first of all, to the English that I speak, but really not just that, really to the understanding in terms of viewpoint diversity and the multiplicity of identities, and also an immigrant, a new immigrant to Israel, somebody who emigrated, actually lived back and forth between Canada and Israel. My own children were also born in Canada. They emigrated as well at different times in my life. That sort of transition between countries, which is very challenging, but affords with it, alongside the challenges, so many opportunities to learn of the challenges of the country. And really, as an international lawyer, I have a first degree in law from the Hebrew University, a master's in law from McGill University, and I'm actually in the process of pursuing a doctorate in law from the Hebrew University and the Freie Universität of Berlin. And I tell you that because that has informed actually a lot of my work, both before entering Knesset and as I exit Knesset for now, in terms of understanding the challenges that Israel faces internally, in terms of its internal resiliency, Israel diaspora relations and the imperative to engage with those. Of course, my own identity and coming from outside, I think, lends itself to having a real deep understanding of the imperative to continue this conversation and engage. And finally, and professionally and academically, the challenges that the state of Israel faces in the international arena, and I'll say not just the state of Israel. So the challenges of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, a single Jewish and democratic state, the only one in the world. And the connection between that and anti-Semitism, and actually, I'm a member of about 8 committees and subcommittees in Knesset, law and foreign relations and defense and women's status and children's rights, and also the Immigration and Absorption Committee, in which I held 4 hearings regarding online anti-Semitism and the imperative to combat it with the major platforms, Twitter and Facebook and Google and TikTok. And actually, following up on those very important hearings in which we discussed the imperative to define a problem in order to address it. In that sense, utilizing the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism in order to be able to define the challenge of anti-Semitism online, but not only online, and create policies that are transparent to the public and also consistently and transparently applied and implemented. That engagement actually led to the launch of an Inter-Parliamentary international bipartisan task force with members of parliament from Canada and the US and the UK and Australia and myself. That task force will continue doing its work in the recognition, not only that we face a global challenge with regards to online anti-Semitism and its effects offline, but, and very important realization, the understanding that anti-Semitism is but one form, possibly the predictive example of the disinformation challenge that we all currently face in terms of digital platform use, and the imperative for legislators and other influential sort of subgroups in our societies to address that challenge of disinformation, because in fact, it is what all democracies share. We saw a little bit of it on Capitol Hill on January the 6th, but in fact, those are challenges that we all face together as democracies, because disinformation threatens the foundations of democracy. And as I said, in that we are together. So that's a little bit of what I've done in this outgoing Knesset. Of course, many more very, very interesting engagements. And regarding COVID-19, I believe that this is probably true for any country and every country, but COVID-19 invented nothing. It only, sort of placed a huge spotlight or exposed what ails each of our societies, each of our countries. And with that brought with it very important opportunities to identify what we need to do to repair. So here we are. Maybe I'll end here so we can have more time for conversation, but heading into the 4th election in under 2 years with a COVID-19 challenge, which, as you know, the vaccination rollout in Israel has been very successful. Thankfully, possibly creating a sense that we go back to routine or back to life, while I very much hope that we don't forego the opportunity to identify all that we can remedy, all that we can change, all that we can fix. And we didn't even touch upon the Abraham Accords, which happened during my time in Knesset. And
with your permission, Michal,
yes.
With your permission, I want to go back to the current elections. To what extent has the COVID-19 situation, whatever that may be, influenced the current elections? So
it's a very good question. And as I said, I treat this and everything I say with tremendous humility and modesty, because really we don't know anything as of yet, and it will take time before we know the results of this election. But there are some technical things, including the way that election day has looked. So for all those quarantined, for all those in isolation, there are implications in terms of the numbers that have gone to the polls, although they are all, they've been accommodated, but apparently voting rates among those that are in quarantine, those that are in isolation and being actually shuttled back and forth to the polls, the special polls that have been set up for them, that has impacted numerically the number of people.
What about the elections themselves, the topics discussed during the election campaigns?
So that's a very, very interesting question. We are in a bit of a stalemate, clearly. We are headed into the 4th election in under 2 years. And the bit of the stalemate has to do with not with COVID-19 and actually not with any huge issues. It's very, very personalized, right? We have a sitting prime minister who's been prime minister for many, many years. And basically the current election campaign, very similar to the last one, is who is for the current prime minister and would create a coalition government with him, and who is against the current prime minister and would not create the coalition government with him. Where COVID-19 may have significant effects is what I said before about the vaccination rollout. It has been extraordinarily successful. On the other hand, and I say this as a legislator that was exposed to the challenges that we have, COVID-19 did expose the challenges we face in terms of education and healthcare and unemployment and economic challenges, of course, that all of our countries face. So it is hard to predict how much COVID-19 will affect these election campaigns, these election results. I will say that I expect that ultimately what the most important predictor of this election, and perhaps, and I'll say for myself, it is why I excused myself from running in this current election, the most significant factor has been and will be in these election results, if there are parties that are willing to sit in a coalition with the current prime minister or not. So it is very much a personalized sort of political situation that COVID-19 plays into, because the current prime minister did create a very successful vaccination rollout. But the beginning of it starts from the prime minister and not from COVID-19 or the vaccinations, as far as I'm concerned.
What would be for you a sort of realistic dream coalition? How would that look like?
So I said, before, and I'm going to repeat it again, I would be foolish to predict in any way what will be the result of this election. It is a big unknown. It is a huge unknown. I mentioned some of the technical COVID-19 challenges. We have what's known as double envelopes. So Israel's soldiers vote in a double envelope so that there's a security that there's no foul play. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands of double envelopes because of COVID-19 this year. The election results will not be known, the final election results, for several days, hopefully as we approach the weekend, but not for sure. And I would say that I don't have a dream coalition in this current structure because, and I say this sadly, and you mentioned that I entered this government, the 23rd Knesset, with blue and white. I say this sadly because we, or blue and white rather, presented a novel idea in the election campaigns that we ran. And that is that what binds us together as an Israeli society in terms of internal resiliency is far greater than what tears us apart. So the general understanding of left and right, that perhaps with the founding of the state was left and right economically. And then when Oslo came around, it was left and right for Oslo or against Oslo. The left and right after, post-Oslo, has been very, very changed dramatically. The ideological differences between what was traditionally left and right, as far as I'm concerned, and it's the reason that I joined blue and white and joined the coalition government, has been very, very, very minimized. And I would say that the good news is that Israeli society is actually very moderate. The majority of Israeli society, I would argue 80%, is somewhere in the center, somewhere where we can agree at least 80% of the time on 80% of the issues with 80% of the people. What you don't see yet, and that is sort of in the failure of blue and white, as we will see, we don't have final results yet, but in this election campaign is a reflection of that, a reflection of the societal changes in the political leadership. What we still do see, and in this election campaign, it's very disappointing for me personally, is a sort of sharpening of the differences between us to sectorial or segmented parties once again. And as I said before, I very much hope as part of the process, and I'm not sure if my dream coalition will come about as a result of this election, but I do believe that we are in a process forward in getting it right.
But if you got the opportunity to structure or to order the political map of Israelis, understand what you're saying is right, left does not work anymore. How would you order the Israeli political issues? What are the main issues discussed that need to be discussed in the Israeli society?
So first of all, thank you for asking that. One of the first bills that I proposed is the Basic Law Declaration of Independence. I don't know how many people here with us know that Israel actually does not have a constitution. And we have what's called basic laws. They have a higher standing, they trump regular laws, but we do not have a constitution. when you look at the Declaration of Independence, upon which this Jewish and democratic state of Israel was founded, all of the foundational principles are there, except that the Declaration of Independence was never anchored into law. And so that is where I begin. It is literally one of the first bills that I proposed. It is where I begin because I believe that below the radar and above the radar, below the surface and above the surface, where we're at nearly 73, and where that 80% that I was talking about, that muscular, moderate, center agrees on is the following. Is the state of Israel Jewish and democratic according to the values enshrined in the Declaration of Independence? Or is it a democratic state of all of its people, like many other democracies in the world? Or is it a Jewish halacha state, so Jewish law? And where I believe that the beginning of our moving forward is to lay the foundation right there. The majority of Israel's public today, by the way, that transcends religion, age, ultra-Orthodox and secular, Jews and Arabs, young and old, men and women. That 80% of understanding that we espouse to the values of the Declaration of Independence, i.e., the Declaration of Independence, in which an ancestral homeland is returned to by an indigenous people after thousands of years of exile, and it ensures equality to all of its citizens and minorities. It's all right there. That it's the nation state of the Jewish people, so Israel-diaspora relations, and that it has legitimacy among the family of nations, that we cannot question the legitimacy. And that doesn't mean we can't criticize. We can criticize any party. But I don't know any other country whose very legitimacy is called into question. And so in that sense, the intersection of the three issues that I'm committed to and that brought me into Knesset are all right there in the Declaration of Independence. It is where I believe we have to begin the conversation and then enter into the next level of, and I always say, we are still the founding generation of this country. So whereas the founding mothers and fathers of this country lay down the physical infrastructure, literally dried the swamps and paved the roads and built the structures, the physical structure, it is our generation that will have to lay the second tier, the next level, the spiritual infrastructure, if you will. What does it mean to have a Jewish and democratic state? And I remind us all that we didn't have sovereignty for thousands of years. It's only natural that this is not a simple task for a people that was, dispersed around the globe and returned to having a sovereign state. It is my argument, however, that as that founding generation that has the responsibility to lay the next level, the next tier, the spiritual infrastructure, beginning with an understanding of a shared vision, of a shared project that is all right there enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, that is where I would begin the conversation. And then begin to understand what it means, Jewish and democratic vis-a-vis conversion, vis-a-vis the issues that challenge us with diaspora, but internally as well, vis-a-vis Jewish and Arab citizens of the state of Israel, and so forth.
If you look at the past year, since the elections a year ago, your party was, of course, very central to many things that happened in the last year. What are, in your view, the most important lessons to be taken from that year?
Oh, you're asking me, Hannah, really one of the most important questions. The first lesson I walk away with is a tremendous pride in the Israeli public. I think we have an amazing people, a very resilient people, a people that is always there for one another. And COVID-19, we touched upon, it only highlighted how much of that resiliency exists. I believe deeply that that as our society has aged, as it's growing, and I'm not one of those people that thinks that we are a people torn apart. As I said, actually the fact that we keep going back to the polls, to me, is an indication that we are somewhere in the middle. We are not an extreme society.
But yet, when you see the discussions that are being carried out during the campaigns, they are quite extreme. We saw very passionate demonstrations. We know that especially online, there are very harsh words being thrown back and forth. How do you orchestrate this with your observation of not being an extreme nation?
Well, there's a very big gap between the public and its political representation, is what I would argue. And I would argue that the sense of responsibility, by the way, it's not just the political representation. You said social platforms. And I think that part of what we all countries, and the media that reflects it need to understand is the sort of polarized discourse that is actually what receives attention on social platforms. You know, I spoke before about anti-Semitism, but it's not only true for anti-Semitism, of course, and other forms of disinformation. It's true for political discourse. And it's true for the creation of those binary black and white sort of descriptions that are very, very, very volatile and very, very viral and receive, you know, are magnified much more, or they're much louder than anything that is the way that I talk, that actually receives very little attention, neither on social media nor on regular media that reflects what happens on social media. That is something that all of our democracies have to grapple with, certainly not just Israel, in addition to, you know, our own challenges. And I think that that is part of the process, in fact. If I had to take away anything after working in all of the committees that I sit on, and I also chair a committee on drug and alcohol use, if I had to take away anything that people don't usually know about the Knesset, it is that the real work is done in the committees. And in the committees, members of Israel's parliament transcend the differences between them, Arabs and Jews, ultra-Orthodox and secular, and actually work together for the better or for the sake of an entire public, of the entire public, despite differences. Now, do we always know how to show that, or, you know, does the media necessarily show that? I would say no. Does it actually give me a tremendous sense of hope that we will get this right? Yes. In that sense, I very often quote the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who differentiated between hope and optimism. And he said the following: hope is the belief that we have to make things better, whereas optimism is the belief that it's going to be okay. In that sense, hope is very active, whereas optimism is quite passive. And it takes a great deal of courage to be hopeful and not very much courage to be an optimist. I am very hopeful after this year in Knesset, as bittersweet as it is to not be running in this current election. I know we're going to get it right. I have no doubt of it. And I am absolutely committed to continue doing my best in order to get it right. But I have to say that if you ask me what are the most important realizations of this year and of Blue and White's attempt, it is that the idea that I spoke about before, the sense of unity that actually needs reflection in political leadership. Because when the State of Israel was founded naturally, it had very sectorial parties. It was coming together from very, very diverse backgrounds, very different cultures, and actually different faiths. We're not there anymore. You even see it happily as part of what we see the effects of the Abraham Accords internally. So between Jews and Arabs inside Israel. And I don't know if people know this, but after the signing of the Abraham Accords, despite the fact that it was at the time of COVID-19, there were flights between the UAE and Israel. And something like 50 or 60,000 Israelis, half of them Jews and half of them Arabs, traveled to the UAE from Israel. Now, what that has actually done, potentially, and I talk often about the Abraham Accords in the following way, in terms of the potential of the paradigm shift, away from rejectionism towards normalization, the pivot away from the three no's, if we remember them from the 1967 Khartoum conference, no to recognition of Israel, no to negotiation with Israel, no to peace with Israel, to the three yeses: yes to recognition, yes to negotiation, yes to peace, in that order. And when we talk about the potential of that paradigm shift, with recognition being one of them, that actually reflects inwards too. It reflects inwards between Jews and Arabs, citizens of the State of Israel. It reflects potentially on the path forward with the Palestinians, demanding actually that we use that guiding principle, recognition, that paves the path to negotiation, that enables long-lasting peace. When you look, and this is fascinating, at what has happened with the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan, we have to understand, when I say recognition, it already was incorporated into textbooks. The Abraham Accords, of course, you know, just their name attests to the fact that shared values are far greater than what, you know, sets us apart. The Abraham Accords have been incorporated into children's textbooks with words like tolerance and coexistence in all those countries. Bahrain and Morocco adopted the IRA working definition for anti-Semitism. I can't give a more incredible example of what it means, recognition, and what it looks like, and the impact that it can have regionally on all peoples in the region, certainly with the Palestinians, and as I said, even internally inside Israel between Jews and Arabs. And we actually see that, again, very hopeful effect.
Yeah, I just have to take a time out and tell our viewers that they need to refresh their website in order to be able to ask questions. I just got a message. So the people who are listening to us, if you want to ask a question, you first have to refresh your screen on Zoom. Going back to us, actually, I wanted to ask a totally different question. Yes, people, we get some questions coming in, and one of them was, what is your impression? What was the, because of course nobody hoped for elections a year after the last ones. What could you explain to our viewers? What was the main reason for the fall of the former coalition?
Technically, the main reason was that we did not manage to pass a state budget. So the understanding that the coalition agreement that bound together Blue and White and the Likud party was based on certain fundamental conditions, one of them being that we will pass a state budget. And you can imagine at the time of COVID-19, the dysfunctionality of government, of ministries without a state budget. And we have to remind ourselves, this is the fourth election. So a state budget, the last time it was passed was in 2018. We are in 2021. That means that it's not that the ministries have no funding at all. They have what's called, 1 out of 12. So they have this continual budget based on the former budget. That is not what we needed during COVID-19 in order
to implement policies.
Not only to implement policies, but as I said before, that COVID-19 created opportunities alongside the challenges to realize and create new policies, to realize what we need to do that COVID-19 either created or has exposed. That did not happen. Now, the minute that we did not pass the state budget, ultimately, the Knesset automatically dispersed itself. That's on the technical level. I'll say something. When you read the coalition agreement that Blue and White and the Likud party signed, what you realize, and this is probably important in our personal lives as well, when there's no trust, there's no agreement that can build trust. And that coalition agreement, and I say this as a lawyer, basically dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's, but at the end of the day, it could not create trust where there was none. And that innate distrust that was inherent to that coalition agreement, ultimately, I would say, is what led to the collapse of the Knesset, the inability to work together. And I will say, as somebody who made actually a very conscious choice, Blue and White was actually comprised of 3 parties. I belonged to what was called Tilim at the time. And my party, Tilim and Yesh Atid, did not join the coalition agreement. And when I entered the Knesset, actually in the very Israeli form of what's called the Norwegian law, because as you know, in Norway, or some of you may know, all ministers resign so that there's no conflict of interest, and the MPs, that enter on the list enter.
This is the case in the Netherlands as well.
So in Israel, that law was enacted, mostly because Blue and White actually was very, very, very damaged. And this is another sort of something to keep in mind as to why the government collapsed. When Benny Gantz, the leader of Blue and White, decided to enter the coalition, a unity government, because of COVID-19 challenges, because it was the third election in, at the time, a year, and a bit, 2 of the other parties that formed Blue and White, Yesh Atid and Tilim, and their leadership decided they were not going to enter the coalition government. In that sense, Blue and White began to be was very weakened by that move, the entirety, but it also left a huge gap in terms of, structure. So when ministers needed to be appointed, what that meant was the need for additional MKs. That is why I entered the Knesset, in fact, because of the very Israeli version. It wasn't 5 ministers that resigned and 5 MKs that entered, myself being one of them. would, one more thing, that's important to sort of recognize in terms of the failure of this and the coalition agreement, apart from, the great distrust that existed and no agreement can actually make up to that, is that the checks and balances between the executive branch and the legislative branch have been very, very, and the judicial branch actually, have been very severely damaged. I'm not going to say damaged. I don't like to be overly dramatic, but they've been called into question, and I believe that that's another significant part of the imperative that we begin this healing process.
In fact, this was my next question. If you give our viewers some explanation about the discussion regarding high court activism and this game, I don't even know how to call it. Maybe you can explain it to our viewers in a few words, because I think this is one of the things people don't understand about the Israeli discussions.
So part of it, again, I very often relate it to the intersection with global processes as well. The politicization of the law, and this has happened everywhere. We can talk about it, from my own area of specialization, international law as well, right? So yes. The ICC, and I was the first-time appointment in the Knesset to be a liaison to the ICC issues. But when you think about the politicization of the law and why it's so dangerous, and I don't like to be dramatic, but it is dangerous, because the weaponization of law for political purposes actually undermines the very raison d'etre of the legal policies, of human rights, of international law, but also of domestic laws. And in many, many ways, I attribute the process that has shaped itself in the state of Israel. And we talked a little bit about before the fact that we don't have a constitution, right? And the process to enact basic laws, when we haven't jump-started the conversation of what we need to be talking about, what it means to have a Jewish and democratic state. What does that look like, Jewish and democratic, when we don't have the foundational principles entrenched or anchored in any kind of legislation that supersedes everything? Again, part of the reason that I believe that the Declaration of Independence has more answers than questions, something that we need to lean on and accept as a beginning, if you will, for the discussions we haven't had yet. What has happened over the course of, and I'm actually a product of the Supreme Court and law school of the 90s. That's when what's called the Constitutional Revolution of Israel began. 1992, the enactment of the first two basic laws, essentially. That constitutional revolution was, first of all, I might have not chosen the word revolution, I have to say. If you ask me revolution or evolution, I'm an evolutionary gal, because by the very fact that you call something a revolution, you very likely will get a counter revolution. So that constitutional revolution has been the process that we are still living today, in the sense that it was the judicial understanding that we need basic laws, that the court system needs basic laws or a constitution to lean on. And the imperative for creating a hierarchy or the rule of law in that way actually led to the enactment of laws that over time weakened the executive branch and the legislative branch, the Knesset and the government. What would have been, and what I believe is the response or the right answer to this, is that we do our job, we being the legislator, that the government does its job, that the government takes responsibility. This brings me back to the beginning of our conversation about what it means to be a sovereign country. And I come from a very seasoned democracy. It's where I grew up, Canada. When I say the words good governance and transparency and accountability and long-term planning and equal and consistent application of the law, those all make sense to me as a Canadian. We have to remember that this country, Israel, this miracle of a country, was founded under a constant state of war, under a constant state of emergency. And so where I believe we are right now is at the imperative for a paradigm shift. No longer an emergency state of being, but rather a sovereign country that can breathe and actually plan forward, create that long-term holistic planning, create that sense of accountability and transparency towards the public, create legislation that is equally and consistently applied to all. That is sort of, if you will, like sovereignty, not as a geographic element, but actually sovereignty is a state of mind. That is where I think we need to be heading. That is the role of our generation, as far as I'm concerned.
And this process is, of course, not very easy. I understand you have to almost leave us, but before we leave, I would like you to say a few words about the ICC and, of course, the court case, which is at the moment at the ICC. And maybe we can start with, or maybe you can add to your answer the question about, in your view, is the ICC decision to take this case, is this an anti-Semitic case?
So it's not where I begin. It's not where I begin because where I believe it's important to understand the ICC's decision should actually trouble all countries, all trustees of international law and human rights, all state parties to the ICC, all donor countries to the ICC, is that this decision overlooks the very mandate of the ICC as a court of last resort to actually be able to hold to account regimes that cannot be held to account. That's the principle of complementarity, and that the ICC has jurisdiction over. Now, we have to understand that the ICC has only state members of the Rome Statute that it has jurisdiction over, and only countries that it has jurisdiction over. In this case, the ICC, despite 7 countries and many international law experts that submitted their amici briefs to the ICC, and actually the dissenting opinion ultimately as well of Judge Kovac, that said there is no jurisdiction for the ICC. And again, I remind us, for the court as a court of last resort, for crimes against humanity, for war crimes, for genocide. And when we look at the state of the world around us, those are ongoing. In that sense, for the ICC to ignore both the very foundational principles of jurisdiction, of complementarity, because the state of Israel, we just discussed, a very, very well-respected court system with the rule of law. Complementarity means that the ICC does not have the ability to inquire countries that actually they indict their own, and the state of Israel does. If God forbid there are ever in a state of war, either soldiers or any other crimes that are indicated even in emergency situations. But the ICC ignored those fundamental foundational principles of international law, upon which it is actually premised, upon which it is mandated. Jurisdiction was ignored, and complementarity was ignored. And at the same time, the ICC's decision, despite its very limited resources, for example, not to investigate Venezuela, over whom it has jurisdiction, despite the fact that external fact-finding commissions indicated that there are real crimes against humanity performed by the Maduro government, and to use its limited resources against a country that has over which, it has no jurisdiction, that has a functioning law, legal system and rule of law, and filed by a non-existent country, because Palestine does not yet exist, which is why it does not have jurisdiction, once again, even by the very complainant. And I want to say one more thing that happened when the Palestinian leadership actually submitted their allegations against the state of Israel for war crimes. That is a violation of the Oslo Accords. We have to understand that is the only legal infrastructure, the structure guiding the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians currently. So enabling the Palestinian Authority to hold the stick from both ends. On one hand, to utilize the Oslo Accords that regulate the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. On the other hand, to violate them by filing that complaint to the ICC and weaponizing the ICC in that way to supersede diplomacy, to actually utilize legal mechanisms and institutions in order to come to some sort of an agreed, it's not an agreed solution, but a forced solution. That is misuse of the ICC, of its resources. And I would say again, that trustees of international law and human rights need to be very concerned. The place where, and some may say, that is anti-Semitism is again, and I go back to the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, familiarize yourself with this working definition. It is the result of a 20-year democratic process, a consensus definition that has been accepted by about 30 countries around the world, because we need to define something in order to be able to identify it and combat it if we intend to combat it or address it. And the IRA working definition for anti-Semitism includes what we call the 3Ds: the demonization, the delegitimization, and the double standards against the state of Israel. And what I just explained in terms of international law, the application or the singling out of the state of Israel that we see over and over again. I mean, at the Human Rights Council, at the UN, year after year. And just this last December, we saw 17 resolutions passed against the state of Israel and 7 against all of the rest of the world: North Korea, China, Russia, the rest of the world. When we see that kind of double standard, and we see it in the ICC decision very clearly, then that is, in fact, a violation of the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. So that's where I do make the case from that perspective. But as I said, I believe that this isn't about Israel, and it's not about Jews or anti-Semitism. This is the concern of all countries, state parties to the Rome Statute or not state parties to the Rome Statute, all trustees of international law, all donor countries to the ICC or to other institutions of international law that actually take our role seriously, our collective role, to the commitment to never again. The ICC, I remind us, was built on the ashes of the Holocaust with the notion of never again as the prospective statement. Never again, in a world of again and again, as we look around, is not something that we only look to the past. In fact, it's the opposite. It's something that we look around us in the present and in the future. That is our shared responsibility. That's what it means to have international law structures and institutions that we are all committed to. And in that sense, the undermining of those principles of international law and human rights undermine our ability to address the culture of impunity, not only of the regime in Iran or the terror regime of Hamas that holds 2 million Gazan civilians hostage, or regimes, in China that has 1 million Uyghurs in terrible human rights violations, or Venezuela, and so on, but actually undermines our ability as a family of nations to uphold, promote, and protect the principles that we all committed to. So, and I was very, very privileged actually to be appointed for the first time in Knesset to address this issue and familiarize our members of parliament, but also to engage with parliamentarians from around the world on this issue, and made very, very important headways and had very, very deep discussions with parliamentarians around the world, because we have a shared responsibility to hold our own governments to account, whether they're state parties to the Rome Statute, whether they're donor countries, whether they're just part of this family of nations that is all trustees of international law and human rights.
I see. But would you advise the Israeli government to cooperate with the ICC now the case is on?
So, we'll have just last minute, so I won't speak for too long. But look, the concern, and I remind us that Israel was actually very, very involved in the Rome Statute, and the concern that the state of Israel had at the time alongside the United States was that the ICC would be politicized and the decisions would be politicized. The current decision doesn't leave us with any less worry. It leaves us with greater concern. Before we can address that question and answer that question, should the state of Israel change its engagement, first of all, it must engage with the countries that, as I said, are all implicated in the ICC's decision. As far as I'm concerned, certainly the 7 countries that submitted amicus briefs and so on. But the other thing that we have to know is that in 2020, over 300 recommendations for ICC reform were submitted to the ICC and to the donor countries and to the state parties to the Rome Statute. Those reform recommendations are actually the path forward, not for the state of Israel, for the ICC, for all world countries, for this institution to actually serve its mandate as a court of last resort for those that need its protection. And once it has met those 384 articles of reform, then I would believe that a lot of the challenges that we see, because they include transparency, they include a lot of issues that actually in this decision, we didn't get into it, but in this decision, who did the prosecutor meet with? Who did she not meet with? Where did she receive her evidence from, and so on? When there is a lack of transparency, and we don't know that, that is a huge issue. And I would indicate that, well, that we know that there is an incoming prosecutor. I very much hope that he will lead this reform, that again, an external expert panel submitted to the ICC for its own reform. And that's where I believe that all countries have a responsibility to ensure that that reform actually takes place. And hopefully that would merit, the faith of the countries that are concerned about political decisions such as this last one.
Wow. Michal, I'm very sorry that we have to stop because you must go. We still have some time. So I want to thank you very, very much for your very interesting explanations and insights. I hope we get more chances to discuss some of these issues maybe in more depth. And I want to wish you success in your next meeting. And I want to tell our audience that we will stay here for the coming 10 minutes. I have some questions I can answer myself, which you did not have the time to answer. But again, thanks very much for talking to us and explaining that so many things. And let's hope the Israeli elections provide some clear situations and a coalition the Israeli public can go forward with. Thanks again very much, Michal.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hannah, and take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.